What's going on, y'all? Welcome to 8 Cubes 1 day early. This is something I do typically when I find that the tier list is something of a new meta descriptor and I don't want to rush it out. I want to take the extra day to make sure I got everything right, to make sure that the tier list ends up in the best possible space that it is, because Arishem ended up completely upending the metagame and making everything very different. So taking that extra time is important to me to make sure the quality stays at a level that I am happy with. Of course, 8 Cubes is another high quality product in which me and Lamby Series, two of Marvel Snap's best players, talk about the impact of the previous week and look forward into the next week, asking the 8 most important questions in Marvel Snap. We're going to start with Gwenpool, a 4/6 with the ability to give cards in your hand +2 power 3 times. And to me, reading it, it looks like Gwenpool will do this regardless of how many cards are in your hand. So a random card in your hand gets +2 power is the actual effect, and that just happens 3 times. So if you have one card in your hand, she's giving it +6. If you have two cards, one's getting +2, one's getting +4. That's how I'm reading the card. What do you think about this card, Lamby?
Yeah, so this card is to me, I don't know how to rate this card because I think it's powerful, but what's holding it back might be the fact that it costs 4, like a lot of the things that in my mind that you really want to buff multiple times and get way like a lot of mileage from it are like, for example, like Brood, Deadpool, stuff like that. These stuff are kind of relatively cheap. So maybe you can like buff them and play them a bit later and stuff like that. But there's a lot of cards that actually, if you give them a random +2, they kind of compound, like I mentioned Deadpool and Brood just off the top of my head. I don't want to say this is a surfer card because it costs 4, but like I mean even if it buffs Shaw, right, it's like compounded buffing as well. I'm not very sure where we can fit this card in. I mean, if it's a 4/6, so if you get to play, I guess two of the cards that she buffs, it's like a 4/10. Even in the worst case, like that's actually kind of strong. But it really depends on how you build the deck for her. Maybe you can literally just splash her into random decks and play her on 4, and all the stuff that you buff is just like good cards that are fine with a little bit extra stats, right? Like a Jeff is a 2/5, a Nocturne is 3/7, Vision's a 5/10, that kind of thing. Like outside of just buffing stuff that multiplies like Brood, I feel like the fact that she just like can be a 4/12 potentially is decent enough.
I think there's like one specific card that I would have liked if you'd mentioned, because it's very similar to Brood, but it's a card that's played a lot more on turn 5, a lot better. That is Mysterio. And that is the specific thing
Oh,
that sticks out to me about Gwenpool
I forgot
is,
about it.
yeah,
Yeah.
Gwenpool Mysterio Mockingbird feels
Oh
like a
no.
thing to me. Like
Oh no,
Gwenpool
it's Mockingbird
Mysterio
again.
Mockingbird, Gwenpool Mysterio Sasquatch, right? Because Mysterio not only is extremely good already, but carries a Gwenpool buff better than any other card. It ends up being
Oh.
2, 6, and 2, depending on where you put the real Mysterio. And that means, especially if you can get multiple buffs on that, if you get multiple buffs on that, that's 2 energy Doctor Doom. Like, that's what we're talking about, is like basically the best card in the game. And so you end up in a situation where like you can play this like, here's my early game, early game, early game, early game. Then turn 4 Gwenpool, turn 5 Mysterio, whatever. Turn 6 Sasquatch and Mockingbird. And it's just like that seems like a big buff to things that are of that nature. I do think she's just going to be kind of generically good. Like if you're
Mhm.
making a deck and you're like, I don't really know what to do with a 4-drop here. I kind of don't have any good ideas. Gwenpool is just probably going to be a card you play because it just seems like that is a smart thing to do. One issue I do wonder about is, are decks like that even able to exist in a post Arishem world? Or are we just like not really able to do that anymore? It's entirely possible that we're just not. Does she go in Arishem decks? That kind of effect seems kind of busted if you're playing it really early, right? Like everyone talks about like
Yes.
Fastos in Arishem decks, which I think sucks. But you
Yes.
can play
So
this and it's like Fastos except for the cards that are already in your hand and also better, and also it's a 4/6 that you play on turn 3. So that seems kind of interesting to me.
I just want to say that like this card, because we mentioned Arishem, right? Playing this card on turn 3 is crazy. Like you just have so much time to play out the cards that you buff anyway, regardless of what you buff. Also playing Coulson on turn 2 and then playing this on turn 3 in Arishem, randomly generated, whether it's generated from the Coulson or generated from Arishem itself. This is one of those cards that you really want to see that you don't mind getting generated by Arishem. Interesting card, interesting card. I'm excited.
Hydra Bob is the card that is expected to release based on data mines in the first week of the season. It is a 1/4 with the ability that says whenever either player snaps, this card moves at the end of that turn. And so that is just a very interesting and unique design space. They've never really been in it before. I think my baseline like idea of this card, there's two things. The first is I would expect this card to not sell well because
Yeah.
almost everyone in the game just bought Arishem. Like I would expect there to be a lot of people who are like maybe they'd be interested in Hydra Bob under a normal circumstance, but basically everyone in the game just bought Arishem. So what's the point of being interested in Hydra Bob, right? Like that's just the reality of the situation that we're in. The second thing I'm thinking about though, and this is like a little bit different, is how good would a vanilla 1/4 be? And do you think it would be good enough to be like a good cards type playable card? Or would it have to be a 1/5 to be good as if it was a vanilla?
I think it has to be 1/5. Also, I think this card is so meme. Like I've never okay. Obviously, there's so much room for design space. Like in a month or so, we're gonna get activate anyway. So that's like a new like keyword and like design space thing. This one is just weird. Like I never thought they'd create a card that like becomes worse or better whether people snap or not. Like it's like I don't know. Like would you play this card in any deck? Maybe Zoo. Maybe you play this in Zoo, but like Zoo has so many better cards to play, right? I feel like this card is just funny. I I cannot take this card seriously, honestly. No, I cannot actually take this card very seriously.
I don't know. Like, I get why they didn't put the fifth point on Hydra Bob
Yeah, I do.
because it's like this is the first time you're doing an effect like this. But I do wonder, like, when you compare it to something like Martyr, right? It's not
Mm,
like it's like maybe we're just missing something with how it plays, or
maybe.
maybe like this was like a silky smooth card and that just got power crept out of the metagame by the 3 months that happened before this, right? Or maybe like this was because like I like the idea of this card. I love the concept of how this card works, right? Like what if this card is like what if this is like a cool thing? What if it turns out people enjoy playing against Hydra Bob? And like that is a fun dynamic to add to the game. And I guess my worry is we won't really get to know that because A, he's not overwhelmingly exciting, and B, he comes out in the week of the season pass, and C, he comes out the week after Arishem. And so you end up in this situation where like he just got the worst possible positioning.
I can think of one use case for this card in like because you mentioned Silky Smooth, correct? Because Silky Smooth, like okay, so recently we got a 1/6 mouse. Mouse got buffed to Mouse
Yeah.
Morales got buffed to 6 power. So this one could be like because normally the things that move in Silky Smooth are like 2 costs, right?
Yeah,
Silk,
it's true.
Jeff, sometimes Nightcrawler. But this one is like a bigger Nightcrawler. Maybe that so-called snap to move is just to trigger a mouse for 1 cost, you know? That could be a thing.
That works, right? Like you
No, but that
go like
definitely
if you
works.
play him in snap, he'll move at the end of
Yes,
that turn. So like
I
there's
assume that
actually
works.
it's actually like the fastest and most guaranteed way to get a Miles Morales down because
Yeah.
if you have a Nightcrawler in hand, you have to play it, wait a turn, and move it. So
Yeah.
there is something to that, I suppose.
Still a funny card, but that's an actual use case.
Yeah. Speaking of cards that are weird and people maybe like or don't like, Arishem has sort of reshaped the metagame of Marvel Snap. He is it's hard to again, it's very difficult to extricate power from play rate, I think, when you have a game like this. But the card is still being played a lot and has a lot of power. And so I wanted to talk about what people have been doing in Arishem recently because to me, the Arishem deck has started to adapt. Like, this is a deck that is now playing things like Negasonic Teenage Warhead or Eliath or Echo because it has one very specific set of problems, and that specific set of problems almost always involves the card Darkhawk, right? So there are multiple ways for the card Darkhawk to like rear its ugly head and beat you if you're playing Arishem. There are several ways that you can counterplay it, right? If they're playing Darkhawk out on 5, your Rogue, your Shang-Chi, they'll do the work there as long as you get priority. That's one method of counterplaying it. If they're doing something like a discount, so Hope Summers into Darkhawk Mystique on the final turn of the game, that's where Eliath and Negasonic and Echo come in. So you have multiple ways to play against the specific thing that beats you, which does strike me as a little bit inbred because it's like the deck is so good baseline just playing above curve that you can run 5 tech cards for the specific interaction that you don't want to see. And I think that is a little bit awkward. But the weird thing, and I get we're bleeding into the next topic here, so I'm going to just say the weird thing and then just leave it brief and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about just the deck here. But the weird thing to me is like that is what like people are sort of missing the forest for the trees with Arishem. They're like, oh, the randomness is overpowered. No, it isn't. The +1 energy is overpowered. Like, what are we talking about here? The fact that the deck gets to have +1 energy enables it to be this sort of like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter that some of my cards suck because I'm playing way ahead of curve. Who cares? And so when people talk about this, like a lot of people are going to cite the randomness, and we're going to get into that then. But I just wanted to let you know, like, no, the deck is good because the deck is good. That's why the deck wins.
Yeah, I just want to add like one or two things to what you mentioned because like we are saying that the deck is good and also that the fact that extra energy is good, correct?
Yeah.
So like in the previous video, I mentioned something along the lines of like Arishem decks still have ways to evolve. So I've heard from different people, and one of the ideas that like came up to me that's really interesting is that if you are playing all your stats ahead of curve, like someone was mentioning to me like Storm on turn 2, you can play
Yes.
Storm on turn 2 and just one random anything that's big in
Very
the Storm
strong.
location. Yeah, and they are not an Arishem deck, right? Your card is generally going to be bigger than theirs.
Yeah.
It's going to be quite interesting. Another one which is very insane as well, which I think is genius, is Dr. Octopus on turn 4. Dr. Octopus on turn 4 pulls all the tech, right? It pulls the Darkhawk, it pulls the whatever into one location, clocks your opponent, and then you Shang-Chi that location. So you clear out all the tech, and then you Shang it, you know? So I think the Dr. Octopus is one other thing that's kind of interesting as well.
I like the dock a little less specifically because of those mirrors, right? Because one thing that happens that like when I play Arishem a lot, like A, first of all, you have to draw both the dock and the Shang. That is not a guarantee.
Yeah.
And B, like you end up in these spots where it's like, okay, I docked and they just like have a free lane now. And like I filled it up with some stuff they were never gonna play, but they're happy to see. And then they just like play Blob Mystique in the other lanes, and you're like, oh, I kind of needed that Shang-Chi to do stuff. And it's like,
I
ah,
mean, if you
all
think
right.
about it, it's like you okay. Maybe if no one snaps, then you play the dog. Then you see, oh, I put the blob on the left. So like,
Yeah.
I guess they're not gonna blob. So I'm definitely gonna win 2 locations with my blob mystique now. You know that kind of thing. But
Yep.
obviously, I feel like yeah, it's harder to do than the whole storm thing because the storm thing
Yep.
is more simple, right? But yeah, this is just like why I feel like Arishem decks, as much as they are definitely strong, I feel there's actually room to innovate a little bit more.
Agree. So let's talk about this randomness thing because it's really starting to bother me how everyone seems to focus on that. Like people are like, "Oh man, I hate it. I lose 8 cubes to a randomly generated card. It's terrible. If there's no skill in it." And it's like kind of, right? But like here's an example. I lost 8 cubes when I had to move a Nocturne and play a Sage on the Nocturne lane, and Nocturne turned that Sage into deep space, and so she was a 3-0 instead of the 3-10 she would otherwise be that would have won me that lane. I lost 8 cubes when I abandoned a lane, realizing what my opponent was going to do, reading it perfectly, and moved the Nocturne to that lane because I had stronger plays to put into every other lane because you try to win 2 out of 3 lanes, and then the Nocturne turned that lane into the Nexus, and I lost. And like, there's plenty of situations in a Marvel Snap where you lose to just like something random happening. I lost to location variants, right? Like that's a thing that's like a big part of Marvel Snap. And I think people are putting the blame in the wrong place with Arishem, where it's like they're talking about like how, oh, it's like I saw the analogy on Twitter. It's like playing poker blindfolded, and it's like, no, it's really not, because
It's not.
what Arishem does when you play against it, if you're playing something like Darkhawk, if you're playing something like Loki, if you're doing that, you are putting them in a situation where like maybe 5 cards in the game can ever beat you. When you are playing a Darkhawk, a 530 something, there are very few cards that can meaningfully interact with you. It's the cards that blow up your Darkhawk, the cards that steal your Darkhawk's ability, and the cards that prevent you from copying your Darkhawk. That's it. Like those are the only things that actually meaningfully interact with you. Blob can, but again, that's not a randomly generated thing. That's a card they put in their deck to deal with the thing you're doing, right? Like I think people get caught up on like I lost to the random generation and not like, okay, if my opponent is staying, what is it that they're staying on? Like,
Yeah.
one thing I think about a lot on turn 6 is like, look, there are a lot of situations where you can lose to a random card. And I get this is weird. Like, oh, I have to play around every card in the game. It's like, no, but you have to like think a little bit. Like, all right, assuming my opponent isn't an idiot, why would they not click retreat later here in this game? I'm very confident I won. What is it that they could be doing? Because like usually the answer is not every card in the game. The answer is like 4 specific things. And then you're like, okay, can I beat that thing? Is that am I able to beat 3 out of those 4 things? And then if you could beat like 3 out of those 4 things, you're probably just like, yeah, fine. I'll lose if they have that 4th thing. And like, yeah, that
Right.
sort of sucks, but it's like that's what Marvel Snap already was. You're playing
Yes.
against closed deck lists. I legitimately lost multiple games to a Killmonger in Zoo. Like, I don't know what to tell you other than this already happens and it doesn't even have to be randomly generated. People can just be running that crap. Like,
Yeah.
it's a very weird thing to get mad about to me.
All right, so based on what KM said, I actually agree 100%. And I'm also gonna be like a little bit harsh here because, like, honestly, I've been part of like competitive like card games for my whole life, and RNG has always been a part of that whole thing, right? I feel like this whole Arishem argument feels like people finding reasons to make an excuse, like honestly speaking, because like random cards in decks on ladder has been happening for like the entirety of Marble Snap. Like people have been always running like maybe 2 cards that are not like the standard cookie cutter, and those are the cards that give them the 8 cubes, right? Like people ran for, I'm gonna give a very extreme example, like Shang-Chi and Shuri in the past, like just to get the 8 cubes from the mirror match. Like it's that kind of thing, right? Whereas for Arishem, the OP thing is not the random generation. That is actually the inbuilt downside. And if you realize that, you realize that the OP thing about Arishem is actually the fact that you're playing big things ahead of schedule. Like it's really like playing that Coulson on turn 2, playing that Blob on turn 5 into the Mystique. Like it's doing the big thing ahead of schedule, and that's what actually makes like Arishem OP. So this whole randomness thing, I feel like you generally need to, okay, and this is gonna sound weird again, but honestly it's skill issue. Like if you're like staying for 8 cubes, if you're staying for 8 cubes every single time they snap back after you play your blob, I mean like if you stay for 8 cubes after you play your blob, like a normal deck will have Shang, right? This Arishem deck that your opponent's playing, even if they randomly generated Shang, the normal deck who snapped you back already has the Shang. So like it's the same. Even if they randomly generated Shang, do you think that like you were gonna win if they snap back on your blob? Like that kind of thing. So like it's the same, like, you know, guys, like randomness will be here forever. And just that Arishem has a little bit more to it. But we need to remember that like Arishem's randomness is the actual downside.
I think the other thing about it is like people only remember the randomness when it's they lost an 8 cuber to it. And
Yes.
they never remember the randomness where like they snapped and their opponent was like, "Holy shit, my hand is like Cyclops and Shocker. I have to leave." Like, because you never see
Yeah,
that, right?
exactly, dude.
Like you only
Exactly.
remember the randomness when it screws you over because that's the only time you ever see the randomness. You never see it when like you snap on them and they're just like, "Oh, nice. I've got Baron, Mordo, and Viper. Goodbye."
Or
Like,
Howard the Duck.
yes.
But yeah. But like I feel like there's this on running thing. Like so it's very hilarious. Like people also keep playing Arishem and the player is so high. Firstly, new card, but
Yeah.
also because whether they like to admit it or not, as much as they get high roll, people like to high roll as well. Like people
Mhm.
like to roll the nuts from Arishem. Like it's just inbuilt character, right? Like people just feel good when they high roll as well. So as much as like a lot of people don't like to admit it, like being the fact that people keep playing Arishem, it's also because like you want to have that off chance of someone randomly generating this win condition and you feel so sneaky about that 8 cubes, you know. Like if someone can do it to you, you also probably enjoy doing it to someone else, whether you admit it or not.
I am really interested in how this card legitimately ends up landing. Like, are
Yeah.
they going to look at this and be like, "We need to do this more"? Are they going to look at this and be like, "Oh, it was like a one-time thing. We're only going to do this like once a year or whatever"? Because when I look at this, I don't know how you can be second dinner and look at this card as anything other than the biggest win you've ever had.
Yeah,
When you
exactly.
have like 80% of the engaged player base just buying a card, right? Like that cannot be anything other than a win. And then you dive into like these metagame dynamics, and like I actually do think that if you want to make an argument for nerfing Arishem, the argument is the metagame dynamics it creates are unhealthy.
Mm.
The Darkhawk in every deck stuff, right? The Loki, like basically it's like Arishem, Darkhawk, Loki, and Clog. That's what's allowed to exist. Like he raises the bar too high. It's hard to play other stuff into him. But again, I don't know how much of that is just like people feeling that right now and how much that ends up being real in 2 weeks. I don't know how much like, Cassandra Nova comes out and suddenly it's just like, oh my god, they have 4 Darkhawks now. They have Cassandra Nova, Absorbing Man, Darkhawk, and Mystique. And it's just like, oh, I can never win that if I'm an Arishem. I can't play this anymore, right? And so it's like, I don't know. My instinct is like, if I am them, I want to let it ride until Cassandra Nova comes out. And then we'll talk about like maybe nerfing this card. Like I do feel like it's very much too early to talk about that right now. But at the same time, it's like I am going to be pretty annoyed if I have to wait 3 weeks and the metagame is just the exact same, which is possible, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about Darkhawk, the man holding back the storm right now. I gotta tell you, I think if Darkhawk didn't exist, there would be so much more validity to people complaining about Arishem. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I think it's possible that if Darkhawk didn't exist, we'd have explored other ways to beat Arishem that we just don't have to
True.
right now. Like, Darkhawk is such an obvious, powerful, and immensely winning solution to the deck that it's just like, oh, well, why would we investigate other ways of trying to beat this when we could just play Darkhawk in it? Like, we just play good cards and then play a Darkhawk, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I teched against Arishem. I'm a genius. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Like, do you think that obviously Darkhawk is hurting Arishem, but do you think that
Mm.
the existence of this card as a one-stop shop for Arishem counters is hurting our ability to find other decks that might be good into Arishem?
I think 100%. Well, because I feel like you mentioned, I think the biggest point here is like it's the easy way out, right? Like it's the easy and successful way out, and like the less successful or like the unexplored methods will require a huge amount of cube loss to figure out. Like you probably have to lose a bit more to figure this out, and like maybe not enough people are actually trying to figure it out. But like obviously there will be people like finding other ways even right now to beat Arishem, and they might have their own theories and stuff like that. But maybe it's less popular. The Darkhawk one is just the easy way out, right? It's just like 5 energy, 30 power, and then the Mystique. Like that's points, right? Marvel Snap is 1 on points. So yeah, this is the easy way out. I also want to talk a bit about Darkhawk being played in many decks right now. I think it's kind of cool. Like we see the resurgence of the IW Invisible Woman Darkhawk thing, right? Like in the past there was like Killmongers and Shang-Chi's along with the Invisible Woman. Now it's like Mystiques and Darkhawks and stuff like that. Even I think Super Giant also sees a bit of play here and there.
Yes.
Yeah, so I kind of like the fact that we have a resurgence of Darkhawk based decks, and there's actually like quite a few you can play. Though there's like I even saw like Darkhawk Annihilus, even though I think that's like not very super effective, but like it's there, you know.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of ways to do Darkhawk things, and Darkhawk being like the good tech card into this meta right now to me is something that I kind of like to see.
I think people just have this aversion to considering it a tech card. Like, they see Darkhawk and they're like, that's not a tech card. That does points. And it's like, no, that's your Mobius. Like, imagine
Yeah,
Loki was as played as Arishem is, and people were like, don't run Mobius. Like that's
yeah.
kind of what we like I get it, right? But I do wonder, like, obviously, this is not a call for nerfing Darkhawk. If anything, I think they should buff Darkhawk. Like, I think this card should actually be stronger and tell Arishem to screw off even more, right? I think that's actually make it 4 energy again. Make it a 4-0 again. Make it so I can like Ravona into Darkhawk Mystique again. Like that's just my turn 6. You do that, and I'm pretty sure Arishem just dies immediately. Like that's the level of power this card is operating on right now. And so I think that like, yeah, sure, I get it. But at the same time, it's like I do wonder if this is stifling innovation just a little bit because it's so good. Let's talk about Loki. A take I've seen, and I'm genuinely baffled at this one, but I've seen a couple takes to the effect of like, I can't wait for Arishem to be the thing that lets Loki finally get nerfed. And I don't understand it at all, and I'm kind of asking like, do you understand that take? Because I don't understand that take. Where's it coming from? What is it getting at? Why would that be true?
I mean, if Loki were to be nerfed, it would have been nerfed a long time ago, right? Because like mid-range decks all die to
Yeah.
to Loki. Like every deck in the game that plays like normal stats also kind of just dies to Loki. Like look, we saw Thanos, right? We saw how Thanos Omega died to Loki. Like it's not Arishem. Like Arishem just happens to be another of those like play good things decks. You know, like you run natural good things in your deck, and like some of the good things you run in your own Arishem deck kill yourself. Like if the Darkhawk is stolen, or if
Mm-hmm.
like like the Mystique or the Rogue is stolen, in that kind of thing. Like you run cards that kill your own deck, and of course Loki is just like it benefits from that, right? So I think this has nothing to do with like Loki countering Arishem. Loki counters like many decks in the same vein, right? Playing big singular things. Like Loki doesn't counter Cerebro. Why? Because Cerebro's like 12 cards of like clockwork working together, and Loki doesn't like it doesn't fuse that into its own deck well.
Yeah.
But for like Arishem decks, the whole point of playing an Arishem deck is just playing like cards ahead of curve. And to play cards ahead of curve effectively, they have to do their own work, right? So those are cards that don't have to synergize. And when Loki steals cards that are just big and don't have to synergize and they all cost one less, of course Loki is gonna be good into that. Like Loki has been good into everything that's like that for the longest time.
What about Arishem's role in the Loki's role in the Arishem deck?
For the mirrors, insane, of course. Like,
Yeah.
of course, it's insane for the mirrors. Okay, but personally though, like my time playing Arishem, I don't think this is just like a good thing. It's more like an enjoyment thing as well. I enjoy playing like the deck that I built, not like the
Sure.
like playing Loki in the Arishem deck. Because like Arishem is already randomly generated stuff, and you play them for like they're not cheaper, but you play them ahead of the curve. So I actually never really found myself needing to play the Loki outside of the mirror. Like in the mirror, it kind of just like wins, right? But like versus other decks, I actually didn't really need to play Loki to win with Arishem. So yeah.
And of course, Clog. Now, the major force pushing Clog forward has been Husky Puppies recently. If you're wondering where the Dagger Clog deck came from, now you know. I last saw it on Untapped with 180 games in top 10% of Infinite. When I checked, I think 80 or 90 of those were Huskies games. So if you're wondering why that list specifically has such a high win rate, such a high cube rate, there is a little bit of sourcing bias here where like it's like there is definitely like one really good player dragging those numbers up, but it is pretty good, right? I do think that Clog is a relatively plausible solution to Arishem. Arishem typically not very good at dealing with a Limbo deck, a Darkhawk deck, something that's going to be reliably running all the cards that are good into Arishem, like Shang-Chi, like various piles of tech cards, right? Like Blob turns out really bad into the Shang-Chi Shadow King deck. Who could have predicted that, right? Like it is a fairly straightforward strategy, but while Arishem is good at playing one big guy in lanes, it's just not very good at like, the things that beat Clog, having Jeff, having Kitty, having Nocturne, right? Like having these things that prevent the Clog deck from actually fully locking up a lane. Arishem doesn't really have the ability to do that. It's like it is just playing dumb stats a lot of the time. And so you have, oh, here's my Clog. Oh, here's my tech. They happen to line up very well into you. And so you have this Clog package working very well. I do think Dagger and the move stuff as a package compared to, say, like, I don't know, Nocturne, Sage, something else, like, I do think it's like kind of replacement level. But
Yeah.
you can tell that the Dagger one has better stats because Husky was playing it. So, shout out to Husky Puppies for getting a bunch of people playing Dagger. Because, like, I definitely saw, like, people, like, stats people being like, where did this deck come from? And the reason it had good stats on Untapped, that's our boy.
Yeah, I don't have much to add for this one because like my personal experience hasn't been too much with like Clog to beat Arishem. Like my like first impression is like is the clogging part really beating the Arishem deck, or is it the fact that they have Shadow King and Shang-Chi and like all the tech? I feel like
It's both.
the what does the clogging really do if you're just playing one big thing per location? You lose to the tech, right? Not the clog, is what I
Well,
think.
it also reduces, like, this is the thing, right? Like it reduces
Mm-hmm.
their ability to like ever randomly generate out of it. They have no ability to
Mm,
do that, right? Like there's no like
really?
you set them up such that it's like you people in Marvel Snap, I think there's this one thing that people really love, and it's deterministic wins. There's a certain
Mm-hmm.
subset of Marvel Snap players. It's like Galactus, Old
That's
Eliath,
true. Prof
Professor X
Cannonball.
Cannonball. Like,
Yeah.
and whenever they get nerfed, that contingent of players gets really mad. And if you're one of those
Yep.
players who likes that stuff, like maybe there's not a huge functional difference between having the Clog there, but what it does do is remove any possibility of counterplay. And there is
Yeah. Oh,
a certain safety people feel in that against a deck that can randomly generate cards.
yeah, that's my exact point that I was gonna say right before you said it yourself, the safety.
Mhm.
Like, I feel deterministic wins provide safety net, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people that like deterministic wins are bad, are worse snappers, but it reduces the level of like intuition you need when you snap, right? Because you have a predetermined GGWP like condition in your deck. Something like Arishem doesn't really have that. I was like, okay, I mean it does, it has a blob mystique, but like a lot of the Arishem like wins, the random ones, come from like you generating random things and you need to piece it together like on the go, like you need to piece together some special win condition on the go sometimes. So I feel like maybe Arishem at a higher level like can come up with wins that are less expected, but it's like the better players know how to piece together random generation. Like by like turn 5, you see this like 2 or 3 random things Arishem gives you, and you're just like, oh, this pairs well with the thing that's left in my deck. Maybe I can go for that, like it's a bit more like case by case, but that's also why it's exciting, isn't it?
Speaking of that last sentence, Lamby, you wanted to put a section on here that we are, we're calling it chill factor.
Chill
That's what we're going to
factor.
call it, chill factor. So, Lamby, tell us what you mean by chill factor.
Right. So as much as myself and KM and like a lot of people that generally like watch this podcast, we actually like actively try to get better at this game, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm like the try-hardiest person that I know as well. Like I really want to like get good at the games that I play. I've started to realize that like Marvel Snap, some of the things that are created in Marvel Snap, like it leans a bit more towards the chill factor, which is basically like, for example, Arishem, right? Like if there was like an actual competitive scene, and then like Arishem is just a tier 1 deck, I guess you can complain a little bit
Yeah.
about the fact that like there might be a bit too much random generation, right? Or if like in a competitive scene, Agatha is legal and like not like you get what I'm trying to say. Like I feel like, don't get me wrong, I love competitive stuff, but like I feel Marvel Snap is leaning more towards having a bit more of a chill factor. Like it can be a little bit more of like, oh, like crap, I lost to random thing. Oh damn, next game, that kind of thing. I
Yep.
feel like Marvel Snap has a lot of that going on. And like to be competitive in this game is also to embrace the fact that there are some games that just you cannot win no matter what you do. Like I'm not trying to say like the games that you should have retreated. I'm trying to say like the games that like you did all the right things, you stay. That one cut out of 5 randomly generated things that could hurt you actually is there. You die and you blame the game, but actually you shouldn't blame the game because like
You did the
this
right
is like the
thing. Yeah.
yeah, like 9 out of 10 times they will die. But the
Yep.
thing is they just happen to have the 1 out of 10. So like it's just really trying to understand and like piece together the fact that Marvel Snap has a lot of these kind of like things that can happen, that no matter what you do, it will just happen and you lose. So like
Yeah.
just chill, guys. Just
Your
chill. Like
opponent got
yeah,
the perfect
just
card off
chill.
of Camp Lehigh, right?
Just
Your
chill, yeah.
opponent got the perfect card off of a Daily Bugle. Your opponent got the perfect 10 plus power card to beat you. Your opponent's raft card. I make plays so often on the raft where it's like both of us got a raft
Same.
card, and my bet is like your raft card is 8 or smaller. Like I
Yeah,
make that play a lot. That is like
makes
a
sense.
common thing that I do. And it's like that's something that you're gonna have to get used to with Arishem, I think, where it's like, yeah, you do
Mm-hmm.
have to just be like, there is an acceptable range here, and I just lose if they're outside of that range. And I guess to me, it's like I've already always been playing like that, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
that's already baked in for me, and it feels like almost like getting thrown with water in your face when people are like, what are you talking about? Like, what do you mean? But it's like, it's all about, the ranges, right? Like when you look at 6 drops, I think, I actually haven't looked into the EV of this, but I'm fairly certain that there's enough of them that are like total ass that saying, 8 or less is like a fine, reasonable wager to make, especially when you
Pretty sure it's
factor
true,
in
yeah.
like, okay, Destroyer and Infinite would be like unplayable or whatever, right?
Zola, yeah.
Yeah. And so like you have like this, like it's like, okay, like I think that's like a fine wager to make, and I make it some of the time, right? Like it sometimes the math suggests that that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I do it. And I just feel like I get why you might not find that fun, but it's like it was already here. I've
It
lost
was always
so
there,
many
yeah.
cubes to Nocturne rolls. So like I still play her. I don't know. To quote Sam Reich, it's been here the whole time. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through this episode of 8 Cubes. Just a reminder, yes, this one is a day early. Not going to make a habit of that. Just wanted to have some extra time to figure out exactly how to organize the tier list because, like, we kind of just went over the metagame here where it's like Arishem, the other 3 decks. So it's like, okay, what variations of those decks do I show? Does Destroy, like, is that good enough to make it on the tier list? What about Mr. Negative? What about things like that? I just felt like I wanted the extra time to make sure the quality was up to the standard of what you guys would expect because Arishem is so new and so weird, and the metagame is like one thing I saw on Discord was Glenn saying we don't even look at like the first 5 days of data when we're trying to evaluate a new card because there's just too much weird stuff happening there. And then that was really what pushed me to be like, all right, I need another day on this because it's like, oh yeah, KM. Actually, you should make your tier list with the first 5 days of data, and then the guy who actually is in charge of this is like, you should never do that. That's bad methodology. And so it's like, yeah, I'm gonna take the extra day. I'm gonna take the extra day, and we're gonna be like, let's see if we can have a little bit more time to assess here. That said, that is gonna be it from us. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Cam Best. He's been Lamby Series. Lamby, take us out.
Thank you so much for being here. This was actually very enjoyable topic to talk about today about all these randomness. It was really fun. Hope you guys enjoyed it as well, and we'll see you guys on the next one on my channel.